Okay, so we're going to get started today with our exercise 210. And kind of like we've been doing, we're flip-flopping back and forth. Today we're going to work in VRay for another day. And I think today is probably one of the more important days in VRay in terms of we're going to really learn about materials. We're going to get a good grip on what makes a material. And ultimately, my goal is for you guys to be able to create your own materials. Because yes, we have a material library. Yes, it has a lot of materials in it that we can use. But sometimes there's just, you want it to be a certain material and you can't find that material and you need to find a way to make it. And so I'm going to walk you through making it. Today there's kind of multiple parts to this. There is a part 2A for people that haven't gone through 135 and don't feel very comfortable in Photoshop. There's a part 2B for people that have gone through 135 and feel comfortable in Photoshop. Most of you are in that group. If you're in that group, you don't have to make all your materials from scratch. You can make some that are adaptations or adaptations. But I at least want you to kind of experience the process of going all the way through. If you are not comfortable in Photoshop and or have not taken 135, it's OK for you to just concentrate on the first part, which is where you're assembling materials that other people have made, as long as you understand the concepts of it. So I will walk through all of that in depth as we go forward. There's a lot on the handout because there's lots of different pieces to this exercise. So before we get too far into the material, I need to kind of explain how materials are made in VRay. And I have some graphics that will help us. And I'm going to show you the graphics first. Then I'll go over and actually tease apart the material so you can see the various pieces and how they work together. So I've pulled these up. There are 4 planes here in Photoshop. These planes I set up in a Rhino file like this to do the rendering. And they're showing us different pieces of the material itself. So the first plane right up here that makes up this particular shingled siding material is an image that is basically an image of the shingle siding itself. It's just a photograph of it. The only special feature to this photograph is that it is a tiling texture, which essentially means if I were to take this piece, copy it, and put it next to it, the pattern would continue across, and you wouldn't be able to see a seam. Furthermore, it tiles going up and down and side to side. And I'm going to show you how to make one of those in Photoshop a little bit later on today. So it's fundamentally just an image. So if we were to open up Rhino, and by the way, I have a sample for you guys to work with here. Under exercise 210, there is a material test 3DM file. I want you guys to open that one up. And I'm going to go ahead and open it myself. And this just gives us a little sample object to work with as we do our renderings. So here's my sample object. I'm going to go into VRay, and I want to load those toolbars before I get too far in here. So I'm going to go to Tools, Toolbar Layout. Let me go to File and Open. And I'm going to go to my flash drive in my Resources folder where I have my VRay toolbar saved. And there we go. So first thing I want to do is open up my materials. And this is all I'm doing is I'm bringing in that shingle siding material so we can start to talk through it. So you don't really have to follow along yet. We'll get to where you'll need to be following along. I'm going to go ahead and go to Load Material. And once again, I'm going into my flash drive, into my resources, into my VRay materials. And this, I believe, was in siding, wood, and there's the shingle siding. I'm going to go ahead, and I forget whether on this I have it on a apparently I don't have it on its own layer. So let me just select the objects, and I'll put it directly on the objects. I'm going to right-click on the material and say Apply Material to Selection. And once I do that, if I were to switch over into my rendered mode, we'd see that it does have the material on it. That's good. So I'm going to zoom in here a little bit as we're looking at this. And this is just the preview version. However, if I were to actually render this, instead of just being a flat plane, this would have some texture to it. So we'll let this finish out real quick. So if we look along this edge, you can see that the shingles actually have a little slope and a little jump to them, like a real shingle would have. The preview version doesn't show me that at all. So essentially what the preview version is showing me is just the flat image. So VRay materials are more sophisticated than just that flat image. So I start with the flat image. That's one right there. That's the flat image. Then I add this second level right here. And this second level is the finer texture level. And so it's the wood grain itself. It's the pieces, the little cracks, the fine surface of concrete. It's those kinds of things. So no big changes, just small changes. This is called the bump map. So I can barely type in here, but we'll say this is bump. Sorry for my terrible writing there. This is bump. That's the next one. So bump map gives us our fine level of detail. So let me go back to this project here for a second. I'm going to go into my VRay material editor. I'm going to look at this. So under the cedar shingle siding, under the diffuse category, where it says color, we've all adjusted color before, there's an M. This means that there's a map assigned to the color, which essentially translates to the fact that there is a bitmap image right there that represents the color or the diffuse color of this particular material. So that's been assigned. That's good. If I scroll down here a little bit further, under maps, you'll see that bump is checked. And this then also has a capital M next to it, which represents the map. This is again done with an image file. And the image file is simply a black and white version of the same image. In this scenario, the black is one level, the white is another level. And typically when you take a photograph, if you adjust Photoshop, you can get it such that there's kind of a big black and white contrast in the image. It's a very contrasty, for lack of a better word, image. And the dark areas tend to be the depressed areas. They tend to be the areas with shadow. The light areas tend to be the areas on the surface. So it's a pretty easy way of getting some of that fine texture. So I'm going to go ahead and leave just the bump on and just the color on. Actually, you know what? I will turn the bump off and I will perform a render so you can see these various pieces as they come together. So this first one has no bump. It's just the image file. It looks kind of realistic because it's coming from the image file. But we see no texture on the objects themselves, and there's a straight edge along the edge here. So if I take that, and I go back to my materials, and I turn on my bump, remember the map is just that black and white version of the same file. When I turn that on, there's also a value to adjust. We'll get back to what that does in just a second. And I turn it, and I render it. Number one, it'll take a little longer to render. But you can see that there's now some wood grain texture on the wood itself. So that is part of what makes the wood look, quote, realistic, because there's now some texture on the wood because wood has some texture. Now to control the amount of this, we adjust the value next to where it says bump map. And this is not in any kind of real world units. It's an arbitrary value. But the higher this value goes, the more texture is going to be on the object. So if I took this and I said, let's make it 10, and I went back and I rendered, I'm going to get a lot more texture on my shingles. And again, when you guys do this, you'll see it as you practice through. So it's a matter of what feels right rather than what a specific value. So I've found on this particular material that a texture of, sorry, wrong option here, a bump map of about 0.5 seems to be about right for the wood. So that gives me the bump map, and that gives me that basic level of texture. The next thing that makes up this image is number 3 here, which is called the displacement. So I'll just write disp for it. So this displacement level is what gives us larger variance in the texture. So if I were doing shingle siding, could I actually make the sloping pieces on the side of my building and create the siding that way? Sure, I could build the geometry, but that's a whole lot of work. So rather than doing the work, VRay allows us to say, take this surface and apply this large-scale texture to it. So in this scenario, we have another file. And if we come down here, it's listed under displacement. I'm going to turn it back on. The map is a little bit different. The map in this scenario is black and white, white being the highest point, black being the lowest point. So if I looked at the profile of a shingle, and so here's my shingle. I'm exaggerating a little bit, right? This point here would be white, and my lowest point right here would be black. So I'd have a gradient from black to white. Now shingles overlap each other, so there's another piece that goes up this way. So when I look at this displacement, I'm really going from white to kind of medium gray, but in between the shingles, it goes all the way back to black because of how the shingles overlap. That gets us the joint. If I was looking the other direction, I have shingles next to each other like that. There's a little gap or a keyway between those two shingles. It gives me that keyway as a step down. So when you're thinking about it, it takes a little bit of time to sort out what's really happening and what do I want to be white and what do I want to be black. So in this scenario, the white value sticks up the most and the black value is sticking up the least, or is actually on the existing surface. So it is important to recognize that this is going to cause things to stick up from the basic surface or out from your basic surface. So it doesn't ever go into. It's only coming out from. OK, so I have that on. This value actually is important. This value is in the units that are default. So in this scenario, I'm working in inches. So this would be sticking out by 1/2 of an inch. So it's an actual value. So I can adjust that. If I wanted the butts of the shingles to be thicker, I could say 1 or 10 if I wanted to stick out 10 inches. That would be a little weird, but you get the idea. So let's do it with the 0.5, which is what the setup was originally. And I'll go ahead and render. Notice that as soon as I turn on that displacement, the rendering slows down. And it slows down rather significantly because VRay then has to calculate the slope for all of these little textures. All of these textures cast shadows, so that the fact that it sticks up, it would cast a little shadow with the sun and the light. So it starts to be a very, very realistic texture, even though I really only have a flat surface that's making it up. So as this starts to render out, you could see right here the little jumps. You can also see the gaps in between some of the keyways where the texture or this surface keeps going back. It's in the shadows here, so you can't see it quite as well. But that actually does exist. If I were to switch the orientation around, you could see the gap in between, or the keyways. Yeah, you can see it right here, the gaps in between. So it's a combination of the diffuse, this would be diff, the diffuse, the bump, and the displacement that give us the final quality of the image, or the texture. And it's added, so we could start with the original image, we add the bump, and we add the displacement. Not every material needs to have all of these. So let's say you were doing some kind of a steel material. You may or may not start with a photograph. For argument's sake, let's say we started with a photograph. Steel tends to be pretty flat and pretty smooth, so it probably wouldn't have a displacement. It might have some scratches on it, which would be in the bump. So depending on what material you're picking, you may or may not need to actually apply these kinds of maps. So let me go ahead and open a different example. I should have gone this way. OK, let's look at this steel siding example. And for whatever reason, this computer loves to open things in Microsoft Paint. I would rather have you see it a little bit better. So I know this is a little bit light. This is corrugated steel. You've seen this at Home Depot. You've seen it on the sides of buildings where it has a wave pattern to it. So same thing. We want to take a flat surface and we want to apply this kind of a texture to it. So we have three components that make it up. The first one is a photograph of the steel itself. The second one is the bump map, which in this scenario would be some scratches maybe. It's not much. You could probably leave it off because the steel is nice and smooth. And the third option, or the third map, would be the up and down corrugations. And that would be in your displacement. You combine all three together and you get the last result right here. So let's take a look at that file in Rhino. Once again, I'm going to go into VRay and then go to my material editor. I'm going to load up that steel corrugated. Let me apply it to my selection. There it is. And so I've applied it here, but again, it's only showing me the preview image, so I'm not actually seeing any of that displacement. Let's look at the material itself. Under the steel corrugated, we again have a diffuse map. So this would be the color, which is a bitmap image that are all the little corrugations there. If we come down here, we do have a bump map. It's set very low, so it's a tiny little bit of scratches. And then we also have a displacement map that is set at 1 inch. So the difference between 0 or black and white should be 1 inch. And so in this scenario, let's take a look at what the map actually is. So let's preview it. And there it is. It's a bunch of stripes. So essentially, let me look at it in Photoshop so I can bring this and you guys can see it a little bit clearer. There's my displacement. Let me go ahead and open that up. And even though that hurts your eyes to look at it, essentially what I have is I have the high point in white, then I have a gradient that swoops down to black, then it swoops back up to white, then it swoops down to black, etc. And so when I apply that to my material, I end up with the ups and downs of this particular material. So let's go ahead and let's render this and see our result. So you can see that the time that it takes to do this is slowing down significantly more because this is a very complicated bump map to calculate. And this may not have been the best angle to see it, but essentially we're getting all of our little corrugations out of that flat surface. I'm also obviously rendering this really close up. So there's some texture mapping issues. Maybe these are a little bit too close together. They're ending up being a little bit sharp. That could be solved in two ways. One, I could change the texture mapping. Two, I could change the material bump so that it, or the material displacement so that it wasn't quite so high. If I came back to my material and I went here and I changed this from 1 to maybe 0.5, it wouldn't feel so steep. It would feel a little bit more smooth. So again, these are all options that you can adjust to get the look that you want for your rendering. So that's with the steel corrugations. Let's look at another example. Let's look at this one. What happens if we want something to be transparent? So in this scenario, it's a steel mesh with these circles cut out of it. So I start with the image of the steel on top. In this scenario, I skip the bump map because there's not any scratches or anything to show up. Then I apply something called a transparency map that tells it where it's going to be cut out. And then when those two come together, I get the final material itself. So let's have a look in Rhino at that material. So I'll right-click on Scene Materials. I'll say Load Material. And I think this is under metal. Maybe not. Is there... Meshes. It was right above me. Thank you. Meshes and screens. There we go. This was the round holes shiny. I'm going to do the matte because we don't need to calculate the reflection right now. All right. So there's my round holes matte. I'm going to right click and apply material to selection. There it is in preview state. But if we look at this material before we actually do the render, we've got a couple things. Maybe not, because VRay decided to crash on me. There we go. So under color, I don't have a map anymore because it's just the dark color that's controlling what the material looks like. So I don't have a map for it. But under transparency, I do have a map. So this is controlling what is cut out and what is not cut out. So if I click on the M here, we can look, and it's the same thing. In this scenario, what's black stays solid, what's white is transparent and see-through. If, by the way, when you create this file, you end up doing it backwards, which I have a tendency to make because I forget which one's which, there is a checkbox right here for invert. Looks like I actually already inverted it because I built it backwards. So it's easy to flip-flop if you end up with the wrong pieces. So there's my map. That controls what's transparent, what's solid. If we come down here, I don't have a bump or a displacement map. So it's a very simple material. And when I come back and actually do my rendering, VRay will go through and it will calculate the surface, and then I'll be able to see through all of these little holes. So I'm going to jump over. I don't need to finish that one. I'm going to open up one more, and then we're going to start to build some materials. It's this yellow mesh right here. Darn it. Paint. Microsoft Paint. Really? There it is. So in this scenario, it's a yellow mesh, kind of a wire mesh that's glued on top of each other and dipped in some kind of vinyl or whatever. So in that scenario, I am combining a couple things. One, I'm combining the photograph of the mesh. Two, I'm providing probably a displacement map that causes it to stick up a little bit. It could be done with a bump map. It just depends on how much it needs to stick up. Three, I'm going to include the transparency map, the part that tells it what's transparent and what's not transparent. And finally, I get the actual material itself. One quick thing to point out, this wire mesh is actually would be, it's a circle, right, in cross section. So it has an underside. VRay would only render the top arc on a displacement map. It would be hollow on the underside. So you have to be a little bit aware of that. In 99% of the scenario, it doesn't matter because you never see anything close enough to really cause that to be an issue. But just I want to point that out as something to be aware of. You could set up a double-sided material where it does it both ways, but that's not something we need to worry about at this stage of the game. So let's look at that material. Let me get back to my file here. I'm going to open up my VRay Material Editor. I'm going to right-click, load material. And this one was the yellow plastic coated. Let me apply material to selection. All right, now the yellow mesh is there. So if we look at this material, we have a diffuse map under color, and that is the photograph of the mesh itself. Then we have, over here under transparency, a black and white map that shows us what is supposed to be cut out and what is solid. So the black areas are solid, the white areas are cut out. Then we come down here, and in this scenario, it was done with a bump map. I told you I wasn't sure whether it was a bump or displacement. Right here, if I look at it, we essentially have a grid with white with a gradient that fades to black. That's going to give us the rounded edges on all of those little cutouts. And so we apply all of those together, and we end up creating this mesh, which if I render out, still working on that one, Notice that when transparency is involved, it gets a whole lot more complicated. And it takes Rhino a lot, or VRay a lot. Come on. It takes VRay a lot longer to actually perform the rendering because it's calculating what's on one side versus what's through, and what if I look through this mesh, I'm seeing something here and I'm seeing something there. It's also casting shadows with all the interlocking mesh. So it ends up taking a little bit more time. But you can see that there is a little bit of a roundness on this mesh for our purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and let this render out. And now that we've explained how these things work, two things I want to point out. Number one, all of these materials have a file that's associated with them. And you've seen me go into it a little bit to begin with. But if I went into my VRay Materials, and let me pick that cedar siding, for example. Inside of that folder, there's a bump map, there's a diffuse, which would be the color image, and there's a displacement. Looks like I made that one backwards. So all three of those files are essential to be able to actually do the rendering. So if you just download the VisMat and load it, you're going to get just a gray blank surface because you don't have these three associated files. So we need to make sure we keep everything with these materials. So I'm going to move into part 2A, which are for the non-135 people. So people that haven't gone 130 through 135 or really don't feel so comfortable in Photoshop. And then we'll come back and do the Photoshop part. And in that scenario, I'm going to ask that you find some VRay materials online that are not for VRay for Rhino. And so there's a great website. It's VRayMaterials.co.uk. And they have some premium materials where you actually have to buy them. They have a lot that aren't premium that you don't have to buy. So here's a corrugated cardboard, for example. So I could go ahead and I could download that material. And I can adapt this material into something that would work for VRay for Rhino. All of their materials are for VRay for Maya and VRay for 3D Studio, I think, on this particular website. So let's go ahead and let me show this folder. There it is. I'm going to right-click on it and extract it. It's important to go ahead and do the extraction. And so in here, we have these are, yeah, there's the materials files to load it into 3D Studio or Maya. But notice that we also have a diffuse and we have a displacement. Those were the two images we were concerned with. So let's look first at the diffuse. So the diffuse is the piece of cardboard, the photograph of the cardboard itself. The displacement, right? So in their scenario, they did a high contrast black and white version to create this. It may be more beneficial to have one without all of these lumps, but let's take a look and see. So if I were going to create this material, I'd go into my VRay material editor. I'm going to right-click and say Create Material Standard. And this was cardboard. So let me rename it to cardboard. I'll go ahead and say OK. And now I need to load those things into this material. So right now I have just a blank default material. So first thing I'll do is I'll scroll up to the diffuse. I'll click on this M next to where it is color. I'll click on that M. I will change my material from being none to the second option, which is text bitmap, which is just an image file. It's going to ask me where that file is. So I'll go ahead, and it was in my downloads folder. There it is, and there's my, diffuse. I'll go ahead and say open. By the way, they were really nice when they created this. It says diffuse and displacement. That's really obvious. Sometimes they're not so obvious. It depends on who made it in the first place. So I'm going to use diffuse here. I'm going to say open. If I preview it, there's the preview of my image. I'll say OK. And if I were to preview this, there it is. Looks like cardboard. That's great. I was able to load it. By the way, stay away from the live preview. That completely loves to crash VRay. So just leave it turned off. When you want to preview, click the preview button. That'll work. So I have my diffuse loaded in. The next thing is I need the actual corrugations. I need the ups and downs. So if I come down here under maps, I have two options. It could be a bump map or it could be a displacement map. There's enough here to where I think it should probably be a displacement map. So I'll check the box for displacement. I'll click on the M that's next to it. I'm going to choose text bitmap, and I'll choose their displacement file. And I'll go ahead and say open. And like I said, this should be a high contrast black and white. I'll say OK. I can click on preview, and it's suddenly going to look a little bit more three-dimensional. But remember, I have to adjust this value. So is my corrugations in my cardboard an inch thick? Probably not. So we need to shrink that down, maybe a quarter of an inch, so 0.25. If I preview it, there'll be a little bit less there. Let's go ahead and assign that cardboard material to my selection. There it is. And then we'll do a test render and see how it turns out. So while this is rendering, essentially what I did is I found a material online, right here. I downloaded the material. I looked at the images that make up this material, and then I adjusted for it and made my own material in VRay with the same basis. We're going to come down here and I'm going to go ahead and download this polished dark oak, and we'll look at that one next. So download now. There we go. We'll let that one download while VRay is finishing this rendering right here. All right, so we can already see the waves. It doesn't look too bad, especially if I stepped back when I did the rendering. So I'm rendering close up right now to get a preview of it. But if I changed and I canceled it and I went back to the view, if I went to set view and I went to render material test there, and I did my rendering here, number one, it's going to render faster because it's further away. Doesn't need to calculate quite as much. And we could look at it and say, yeah, you know what? That looks pretty reasonable. So thanks to VRayMaterials.co.uk, we get a nice quality material out of it. So let's do that again. This time, I downloaded the polished dark oak. Let me go ahead and show this in a folder. I'm going to extract all. And there it is. So it looks like I have diffuse, and that's it. So the diffuse here, OK, there's my piece of oak. We hope that it's a nice tiling texture. I don't know for sure. I didn't create it. That looks pretty good. It also looks fairly smooth, so I'm not overly worried about too much texture, though it wouldn't hurt to add a little bit of texture to it. It is still wood. Unless it was polished with like wax, it's going to have a little bit of texture. So maybe on this one it'll be a good hybrid, because I'll go and create the black and white in just a second. So let's go ahead and go back to my materials file here. I'm going to click on the VRay Material Editor. I'm going to right-click on Scene Materials and say Create Material Standard. This was wood, dark oak, polished. And I'll say OK. First thing I'll do is I'll load up my diffuse map. So I'll go to the top drawer here. I'll click on the M next to color. I'll choose text bitmap. And we'll go to the polished dark oak. There's my diffuse. We'll go ahead and say open. We can preview it there. Yep, looks OK. We'll go ahead and say OK. And now we have a preview of it. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Now remember, this was polished dark oak. So if it's polished, it probably has some reflection or some shine to it. So right now, if I were to apply this to my material here, and I were to do a rendering of it, it would end up just being very dull, because it doesn't have a shine to it. So it would end up like this. So I need to make sure that I add a shine. So like we did before when we did reflections, I'm going to go ahead and add a reflection. So I'll click on my VRay Material Editor. I will right-click on my material itself. I'm going to create a reflection layer. There's my reflection drawer. It opened up. If I were to preview it, we'd see it as pretty shiny. This may be too shiny or too polished, so I might change the glossiness down. So maybe I'll change the highlight glossiness to 0.75. Let's take a preview of it. That's a little better. Let's take the reflection down to 0.75. Yeah, it's more of a matte finish. Let's go up a little bit, 0.85. And there you go. That's a pretty good reflection. Now that I have that, if I went back to my rendering and I rendered it, we'd end up with a little bit more shine on the object. And so you have to do the actual render, test it out, see is that too much shine, is it not enough shine, does it feel right, does it not feel right. If it was too much, I might go back and I might adjust it. If it was too little, I might increase it a little bit. To me, that's actually not too bad. It feels about right. Now remember I said that it would be nice in this material if there was a little bit of texture to it, because it's still just a flat image. And we could see that if I zoomed in on the material like I did before. It's going to appear as perfectly flat. So in this scenario, I'd like there to be some bump. So I'm not doing any displacement. There's no major jumps in the material. I'd like there to be just a little bit of texture. That would be in the bump. So if I took a look in Photoshop, if I went to File and then Open, and I opened up that download file there, and I opened up this diffuse image, and I looked at it, essentially what I want to create is to create a black and white image of this particular file. Ideally, a high contrast black and white image. So just like we did in 135, if you were in my 135, I'm going to create an adjustment layer. I'm going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to come down here to a channel mixer, and I'll say OK. And here in the properties of that channel mixer, I'm going to turn on monochrome, and that makes it black and white. As I've talked about before, there are presets that it wouldn't hurt to jump through, because you can see maybe one of these presets gives us a little bit more contrast than another. I'm a big fan of double checking with that. I think I kind of like the infrared one, but I don't have a true nice white just yet. So I'm also going to add a levels adjustment. So I'm going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Levels. And I'm going to pull this down so I create a white and I create a nice strong black, something like that. So it's a high contrast black and white image, something along these lines. From here, I can go ahead and go to File, Save As. We're going to create a JPEG out of this. And this would be bump. And I'm putting it in the same folder. And I'll go ahead and click on Save. Let's do maximum. I'll say OK. And there it is. Now I can go over into Rhino. I'll go back into my VRay Materials. And right here, I'll come down to the bump option. I'll check the mark for bump. I'll click on the M next to it, and I'll assign it that bump map that I just created. I'll go ahead and say Open. And I'll say OK. And if I were to just preview it, we'd see that now it has a texture applied to it. I'm not sure that this value is the right value, so I'll go ahead and perform a full rendering and take a look at it. So it definitely has some texture now. My guess is it's probably too much texture. So I'd go back. Oops, sorry. And I might say, you know what, that really should be maybe down at 0.15. Yeah, that feels a little bit better. And then I go ahead and render again. and this time it should be a little bit better. Remember, because of the reflection, I'm getting reflection off of the wood material itself. That's part of why there's these little streaks in it. If I were to jump back on the rendering, this would make a lot more sense. So let me go to my set view, my render material test view there, and then I could do a render from a little bit further away. And the texture will be there, but it won't quite look so pixelated. So I was able to take that material from VRay, from the VRayMaterials.co.uk, and adapt it into being a good material in Rhino. So for part 2A of the handout, I'm asking that you do that with 4 materials. If you have time and you can create more, create more. All of them are going to be different. They're going to require different settings, and that's to be expected of those materials. Stay away from clear materials for now. You could do like meshes and stuff, but like glass or plastic that's transparent or whatever, don't worry about that. That has kind of its own realm of settings. For part 2B, this is where you create a material yourself. I'm going to do it in front of you. If you took 135, I would ask that you try to do one of these. You'll learn a lot more if you actually try to make one of your own. So I'm going to walk you through it. What I would suggest if you're a 135 graduate, try to do one of your own. Do some from the VRayMaterials.co.uk so you get some experience, but you're not bogged down in, oh, I have to make 4 materials. So obviously, creating your own material requires a lot more work than just adapting one that's already been created. So first thing I need to do is decide what material I'm going to create in the first place. And so if I'm doing that, I would be looking on, I think a good place to start would be Creative Commons search. So search.creativecommons.org. I can't type today. There we go. And I would pick something like maybe wood siding. And let's do a Google image search. And I'd be looking for some kind of a wood siding. So picking the image is important. So like picking this image here wouldn't be the best image because the texture's on an angle, and it would be harder to create it. Some of them we could do. Something like this is a pretty easy, it's an ugly color, but it's pretty easy because it's already relatively horizontal. So what I like to do is, as I'm going through, I like to open them in new tabs, just so I can come back and look at them a little bit later on. That one's not too bad. The other thing to be aware of is when you end up with lots like this one, for example, it's a very pretty photo. See if I can pull it all the way up here. Come on. All right, well, that's really annoying. You can see how the scratches that are on the wood are very noticeable and they're very distinct. If this pattern were to repeat, we'd see the scratches over and over and over. So you have to be careful of those kinds of things because they're going to end up causing, to your eye, a very clear repetition. And you really don't want that. So try to pick ones that don't have that clear repetition. So something like this might be good. The other strategy sometimes is to go to a manufacturer's website. So if you wanted something specific, so like, let's say a hardy material or something, you could actually go to that manufacturer. You could create it from their stock photos, and sometimes that's a useful strategy as well. So something like this one, even though it's on a diagonal, could work. We just have to straighten it up a little bit. Okay, I'm going to pick this one, even though it's a little bit ugly, because we'll be able to see it, and it's a good way of kind of looking at it. So let me go ahead and visit the website. There we go. It's a nice high-quality image. I'm going to go ahead and download. Looks like they have I don't want to pay for it, so I'm going to use the free download here. And there it is. I'm going to go ahead and open that up in Photoshop. So I'll go to File and then Open. And that was in my downloads. And we'll open it. So this one may already be a tiling texture. It may connect from one side to the other. I'm not entirely sure. I know from the top and the bottom it wouldn't work because this seam here would give me a really short little tiny bit of siding. If I imagined this edge connecting to that edge, I'd have a little tiny stripe. So something's wrong. So I need to go ahead and do some cropping to get these set up correctly. So I'm going to use the crop tool first. And I'm going to pull the crop tool down so that it's roughly in the middle of one of these segments. The other option would be to pull it so that it's right on one of the edges. So I could go right to that edge right there. And I could pull it to this edge right there. And so by pulling it to those edges, when I commit to it, I could imagine this edge lining up perfectly with that edge. It looks like I have a little bit of an issue at the bottom here because this line, see how it comes up just a little bit? That could be problematic when I go to tile them together. So sometimes you end up having to cut off more than you originally intended. So I might come back to here when I did my cut. The other option, and go back to there, is I can use something called a skew to adjust it. So let me back out for you for a second. Let me go into Edit. Oops, sorry, I'm still in my crop. There we go. I'm going to go Edit. It's a locked layer. I have to right-click and say Layer from Background to unlock the layer so I can work on it. And then I could go into Edit, Transform, Skew. And what that's going to allow me to do is to pull one edge down just a little bit. So you can see how I'm pulling that one down to maybe right there, where I'm losing that little bit of curvature at the end. So now that I have that set, we can commit to it. We can double check my crop. Yep, all of that looks good. OK, so this image should be fairly close to being able to be tiled. It's not necessarily a tiling image yet. There is a command in Photoshop. By the way, all of this I should mention, if you get a little bit lost with what I'm doing, on the course website, under the tutorial section, under Photoshop, there is a tutorial for tiling textures right here. And this walks through everything that I'm doing if you end up getting lost. The only thing I say in here is to crop it square. You don't have to crop it square. It can be a rectangle. It's fine. You just, sometimes people need to think of it as a square because it's easier to think about how it repeats. So, well, obviously mine's not a square, but I'm still going to be able to make it work. The next thing I need is I need to know what the overall size of this image actually is. So I'm going to go up to Image and then Image Size just to have a rough idea. So it looks like it's 1920 pixels by 1376-ish. I'm going to use, here under Filter, I'm going to use a command called Other and then Offset. So I've gone to Filter, Other, and Offset. And what this does is it takes my image. I'm going to draw here on the board for just a second. So let's say I have my image. And it's in its most simple sense, I will do it just from one direction to start. It will cut right through the center of the image. And if this was 1 and this was 2, it will take 2 and put it over here, like that. If I do it 4 ways, it gets more complicated, because it's going to take my image, cut it here, cut it here. If this is 1, 2, 3, and 4, it's going to take 4 and throw it all the way up here. There's 4. Then it's going to take 2, and that's going to go up to here, and that's going to become 2. It's going to take 3 and put 3 over here, and that's going to become 3. So it's essentially slicing up the image and taking the pieces and reversing them in both directions. So we can see that actually happen. So if I'm here in the offset, I have two options. I have horizontal and vertical. In an ideal sense, I would take my value and divide it into my image size. So my width was 1920, so that would be, what is it, 910. And when I did that, do you guys see that seam running right down there? Right? There's a little faint seam. It took those two pieces and it flipped them. Now I would do the same thing vertical. That was like 1370, so we'll do it at maybe 750. And so when I do that, oh, we've got another seam that's happening right there. So I have to then, when I'm done with this, I'll say, OK, I have to fix these two seams to make it feel like this belongs together, so we don't have these errors anymore. Good news is down here it's pretty close. Up here, not quite as good. I'm going to use something called the clone stamp tool to fix a lot of this. So I'll come down here to the clone stamp tool right here. And the way that the clone stamp tool works is essentially we can copy from one area over to another area. So I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger. I did that by either dragging the size here or using the bracket key on the keyboard. I'm going to hold down the Alt key. That means copy from. I'm going to copy from here. And as I move it over, I can slowly start to adjust the height across that seam. There's still a little bit of issues in here, so I might have to do a little bit of copying across there. Maybe a little bit right in there. This one's going to take a little bit more work to get those to mesh together. We'll go right about there, right about there. I need to fix this top. Same thing. We'll connect those together. I know I can make this look really easy, but recognize, of course, I've done this for a long time. So it takes a little bit more time. So I'll work my way all the way up. Alt, copy from. Maybe like that. And maybe about like that. Something like that. We'll come down here. This one's kind of problematic, obviously. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy from right here. I'm going to go straight down to where I would be at the seam. And I'm going to copy the seam from above. Right across like that. I'll copy from here again, just to cover up that last little bit. About like that. A little bit more copying. Copy from. We'll seam that across. We'll seam those guys across a little bit. And about like that. A little bit more down here. Copy from. That's a little bit harder to seam because of the wood grain texture, but okay, that's fairly reasonable. I'll press Control-0 and zoom out. Okay, the seams seem to have gone away. That was my goal. So I spent some time with that clone stamp. Now that I have this established, I'm going to save first off the color version, which would be my diffuse. So I'll go ahead and I'll go to File, and I'll go to Save As. I'm going to change my color or my type to be JPEG, and let's go ahead and, well, we can put it in a folder here in my downloads folder for now. Let me get a new folder. We'll call this wood siding, and this was diffuse. And I'll go ahead and choose Save. Full size. Next one was the black and white, high contrast. So that was under Select or Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Channel Mixer. There we go. I'm going to turn it monochrome. Once it's in black and white, I'm also going to go back to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, levels, because I need to make sure that this is high contrast. I need a nice dark black, and I need a nice bright white in the front. You can also skew the image over just a little bit to make those grooves stand out just a little bit more, maybe about like that. Once I'm done here, we'll go ahead and go to File, Save As. This is going to be a JPEG again. And this is going to be bump. We'll go ahead and save. So I have my diffuse, I have my bump. Now I need to think about what does this look like from a displacement standpoint. So in this scenario, the siding probably laps because I've got a nice strong line along that bottom edge, and it would slope backwards to go underneath the siding that's above it. So I would need a gradient that was going from white at this front edge to black at the back edge. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and create, and I'm going to use the polygonal lasso tool, and I will draw a box right along this front edge. Now this siding ends up being pretty darn straight, so I can get away with this polygonal lasso rather easily because it's pretty darn close to this edge. Come down, and I'm going to go right along this bottom edge. Maybe like that. We'll come back up and close it. There's my selection. Now I'm going to use the gradient tool right here. And I've already got black and white selected. White was this bottom edge. Black was the top edge. I'll go from black. I'm clicking and holding, dragging straight down. You can even hold down Shift while I do it. Stopping at the front edge. Sorry, that was on a levels. I need a new layer to do it first. One more time. From right here, hold down Shift to right there. And that's creating the gradient. Obviously, it's in red, not in black. Try that one more time. Right there. There we go. So I have a nice gradient going from black to white at that front edge. Now all I have to do is repeat it. So I'm going to take and go a little bit faster so you guys don't have to sit and watch me do it, and just create a basic rectangle. I'll go back to gradient. I'll go from the front edge, hold down Shift, to the back edge. Sorry, other way around. Like that. Another rectangle. Gradient. Like that. I'll do this lower one. Oops. There we go. And I'll do my gradient. Helps if I choose the gradient tool first. There we go. So I've done all of them except for the top and the bottom. Now notice this top and the bottom, they're split. So I don't just draw a rectangle. Let me zoom out just slightly so you can see this here. I don't just draw a rectangle like this and do white to black, because it's not the full dimension. It's including this one here. So sometimes it's easier to keep your selection like that, and to actually move the selection like that. I'll copy it, Control-C, Control-V. I can then move this one back into there. And I can do Control-V one more time, and I can move this one up to right there. And so now this edge there is going to match up with that edge there. So now that I've created this pattern, I'll go ahead and save this one. So I'll go to File, and then Save As. And this is again going to be a JPEG. And this time it should be the displacement. And I'll go ahead and save. It looks like something went wrong with my original blue siding right here. So I'm going to do that one more time. I'm going to go to File, Save As, JPEG. And this was my diffuse. And so now that I have those components, it's time to go ahead and make the material itself. So I'll go over into Rhino. We'll go into VRay. I'll go to my VRay Material Editor. I'm going to right-click here and say Create Material Standard. And so this is siding horizontal lap, for example. And then I'll load up all the various pieces. So right now it's just gray. At the top here, I'll click on diffuse. Under color here, I'll click on the M for the map. I'll change to a bitmap. And I will pick my, oh, come on. I didn't actually say save, sorry. I'll pick my diffuse and say open. I can preview it to make sure it looks okay. Yep. I'll go ahead and preview this. Yep, okay, looks good there. So I have my diffuse. Next thing I'm going to do is come down here to bump. I'm going to turn on my bump map, click on my M next to it, and I'm going to assign the bump map. I'll click on preview. There it is. I'll say OK. I could preview this and see what it looks like. That gives me that little bit of texture. I'm going to leave it at 1 for right now because I haven't done a rendering to see what that texture is going to look like just yet. The last one is the displacement. So I'll check the box for displacement. I'll click on the M. I'll go to my text bitmap, and I will select the displacement. I'll go ahead and say OK. There's my displacement. I'll go ahead and say OK again. And this time, the value is how much it sticks out. So I'm going to start at maybe 0.5, ½ inch. And I can preview it, take a look at what it looks like. All right, seems reasonable. Let's go ahead and right-click and apply material to selection. Whoops, I don't have it selected anymore. I'll apply material to selection. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so I can see it a little bit closer. And we'll go ahead and do a test render and see how it turns out. So it looks like I was able to create the lap. The lap might be a little bit strong. It might be too much. So I might have to go back and tone that down a little bit. The bump also is giving me pretty heavy texture. So I might go back, now that I've done that rendering, into my VRay Materials. Change this to maybe 0.5. Change this to maybe 0.25. And say, OK, that sounds pretty good. And then I could do another test render. When I'm all done, I'm going to go ahead and jump back into my material test view, this one, and do a full sample render of my object. So once this rendering is complete, this is what I'm going to use for my post. This is my full, this is my featured image for my post. So I feel pretty good about it. Turned out the way I want. I've got the little steps on it the way I want. OK, I'm pretty happy. So I will save this as my featured image. There we go. I'll go ahead and click on Save. And I'll save this as my featured image. I would want to put this into my flash drive, into today's folder. And so let me create a new folder here. This was This is just calling that sample. But I also need to save the whole material. Now remember I told you that those pieces, the diffuse map, the displacement map, the bump map, those are all vital to making the material work. So I have them kind of scattered. They're in my downloads folder. So if the computer were to restart right now, I'd lose all those files and I'd have to create them again. So once you've created the material and you're happy with it, and you're happy with all the settings, we can actually force VRay into building the material into a little zip file that you can then keep with you. And so we'll do that by taking the horizontal lap siding here. I will right-click on it, if VRay doesn't crash on me. And I will say pack material. And that goes and gets all of those files, the displacement, the diffuse, etc. And it builds them all into one zip file. So I'll go in here to my folder here. And this was it was right here. So this is my siding horizontal lap. I'll go ahead and save it. And that then collects everything. So if I went to my flash drive, and I looked at what I just created, there's that horizontal lap siding. If I extract that, there it is. There's the bump, there's the diffuse, there's the displacement, and there's a little sample image for me. So that's all that I need. So I can then put that into my material library and I can have it forever. When you make your post today, you're going to post two things. One is this sample rendering as your featured image, but the other thing you're going to post is this zip file that includes what you need to be able to make that material. So I go to the course website here and I go to new post. And I would say this is siding horizontal lap. I would go ahead and add media, and I'm going to upload sorry, it was on my flash drive. There it is. I'm going to include that. And once it's uploaded, I'll click on Insert into Post. It's just going to be a link to that zip file. So this would be download material zip. And we can put a little bullet point in there so it looks nice. And then I would come down here to the very bottom, click on Set Featured Image. I'm going to upload that sample file. There it is. And I would go to Set Featured Image. There's my featured image. Now there's also a box for VRay Materials. This will help people to find other VRay materials. So I'd come down here. This should be under Siding. Wall materials. These are things that other people have created. Anyway, I could add more if I wanted more terms there. When I'm all done, I would also categorize like I normally do. This is exercise 210. And I will go ahead and publish this post. Now, you're going to create somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 posts today. So it's 1 material per post. So I'm expecting multiple posts as you create it. If you got it from the VRayMaterials.co.uk website, put a link to their material. That's a nice thing to do. But if you create it yourself, maybe put a link to the original material that I could go back and find wherever I put that and put a link to the original file. One other thing I'll point out is that in my case here, I have this ugly blue color. Once I create the diffuse and the displacement, that works independent of color. So I could actually change my material to not have the blue photograph, because the blue photograph doesn't matter that much. And I could instead assign colors based on particular color values. So if I knew, for example, the paint color that I wanted to use, I could then assign a particular paint color by RGB value. And once I did that, I could then render it, that siding, in that particular paint color. So in this scenario, I did it as kind of a white. But it's still going to have all the same texture. It's still going to have the same laps. And so it will still look like siding. It's just in a different color. So sometimes that's, yeah, there you go. You can see the laps there. So sometimes that's an advantage. And a lot of the paint manufacturers will give you an RGB value for a particular piece of color. So if you wanted to use a particular paint, you could do it that way as well. OK, so at this point, I've gone through what I wanted to demo for you. It's your turn to go ahead and give this a shot and see how it works out. I would like you to attempt both the full Photoshop, create it from scratch, and they find something online and adapt it. But again, it's going to be dependent on you guys. This is a great opportunity for you to think through materials and learn how to make your own unique material.